We're just delighted to have this panel, celebrated authors, and you're going to hear from them in just a minute. And I hope that you'll all stop by the table out front and get a book. And you better go fast because I saw them moving out pretty quick. Please support the History Center and these wonderful authors by picking up a book before you leave tonight. One other thing, I have an announcement. There will be a program at the New York Botanical Garden in their NYBG 125 program, and I'll just read this. It's Science, Conservation, and Humanities Seminars, the ethnobotany of the 17th century Amsterdam, New Amsterdam, thank you. And Joel Warren Grossman, sitting right up here in the front, archaeologist, will be the primary speaker in that event. And Joel always has an interesting way of looking at things, and I think you will be happy if you attend that event on Friday, November 18th at 11 a.m. at the Mertz Library at the New York Botanical Garden. So I'll repeat that. Friday, November 18th, 11 a.m., Mertz Library at the New York Botanical Garden. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Pat Bonamy, the chair of our program committee.
Thank you, Casey, and welcome everyone to our wonderful program this evening on the Dutch and Native Americans in New Netherland. I also wish to thank the Netherland Club. This is such a beautiful ballroom. This is the ballroom we're in. We didn't plan any dancing, but maybe we should do that another time. And in any case, we are particularly grateful to them for hosting this event, as Casey said. Also, the Consul General of the Netherlands, which the office of whom has for a number of years now been major supporters of New Amsterdam History Center programs, and we're grateful to them and the other supporters of this evening's program. And I want to thank the audience for coming. Fortunately, it didn't rain tonight as they said it might, and we appreciate your presence, and I think you'll find we have an exciting evening. And then I especially want to thank our three speakers, Daniel Richter, Cynthia Van Zandt, and Andrew Lipman, who will be talking to you about Native Americans and the Dutch before long. Now, here is the plan for the evening, the sequence of events. I'm going to introduce just Dan Richter, who is our senior scholar and the moderator of the panel and for the evening. And he in turn will introduce the other two speakers when their turn comes. Each of them will then speak on their chosen topics. As you will see in the program, they are listed there, so you can attach the names to the topics. And when that is finished, that part, then we will have an opportunity for questions from the audience. And we particularly want to do that because we always have found at our programs that you have wonderful questions to ask, and you know a lot about the Dutch. We'll see how much you know about Native Americans. Have a little test. Then after the formal part of the program is over, we will, you can also have a drink and a little more to eat, but we also have books for sale, one from each of our three speakers. And if you buy a book, they will be happy to sign it for you after the program. So with that, let me introduce Daniel Richter. Daniel K. Richter is Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's taught there for many years, but in recent years he has worn two hats because he is also director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, which he has turned into a major hub for the study of early America. He's done a wonderful job there. People come from all over the country, even out of the country, with fellowships, and they do their research and produce much of what we come to know about our early American history. Dan has a long curriculum vitae, as we call them in the academic world. But I'm not going to take much time. I'm going to just hit a few highlights. He's lectured widely throughout the United States, and he also was Fulbright lecturer for a year in England recently. and he has written many books. I am not going to mention them all, but he is an expert on Native American history and early America, and has won many honors for a number of these books. I'm only going to mention two because they're particularly pertinent to our subject this evening. One is Facing East from Indian Country, the subtitle of which is A Native History of Early America. In other words, it's history from the viewpoint of Native Americans about early America, rather a different perspective than we usually get. And that is the book that we have for sale after the evening's program. That was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in, I think it was 2010, if I recall correctly, or 11, thereabouts. He doesn't even know. He got so many honors, he doesn't even remember. The other book that I particularly wanted to pick out to mention is The Ordeal of the Longhouse. This is Dan's book about the Iroquois nations up in the upper Hudson Valley and west from there. And I think it is absolutely the best book that's ever been written on the Iroquois nations. So that one we don't have tonight, but you could certainly find it online and at your bookstore. So that is my welcome and my introduction of Dan, and now I am very pleased to introduce Daniel Richter.
Thanks, Pat, for that over-the-top introduction. I could listen to you all night. And thanks, everybody, for coming out. Thanks again to our hosts and sponsors, in particular to Pat for inviting us here, and to Casey Kemper and Esme Berg and everybody else. This is a beautiful room, as you just said, but we have a distinctive perspective up here because we're sort of looking at fractured images of ourselves in that mirror behind us, and then the multiple mirror effect is going on. So if we start looking hypnotized or lose track of our thoughts in the middle of the talk tonight, it's because we're staring into infinity up there. Well, we're going to proceed in a slightly different order than in the program because we just want to be arbitrary. No, because I think that there's actually a logic to starting with Professor Lippman's paper and then moving to Professor Van Zant's, and then I will finish up, or if they go on too long, you won't even have to listen to me, so I'll put me at the end. But we're going to be moving sort of in chronological order. So our first speaker is Andrew Lippman, who is Assistant Professor of History at Barnard College, and previously taught at Syracuse University for several years before moving to New York in 2015. As a BA from Vassar, master's from Oxford, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied with one of the three people on the panel here as his advisor. His wonderful first book, which is for sale out in the lobby, it's The Saltwater Frontier, Indians and the Contest for the American Coast, received a number of honors, but most notably won the Bancroft Prize in American History, which is a big deal, perhaps the biggest prize there is to be won. He has published widely in articles and in online journals, and has received many fellowships, and I'm just very pleased to introduce Andrew to you tonight for his talk on Munsey's, New Netherland, and the Saltwater Frontier. Good.
Thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and I also want to offer a thank you to Pat for inviting me here tonight, and to the entire, this entire organization seems very welcoming, and I'm excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about my book, and really just talk about one little aspect, one little part of it, and give you a sense of what I hope my contribution is, and some new things that I hope I'm saying. My book is called The Saltwater Frontier, and it's based on a really simple idea. I'm sure it's not a surprise to any of you that the Dutch were a maritime people with a very active maritime culture. And the simple point that I make in my book is that Native Americans in this region had a very active and interesting maritime culture too. Obviously not capable of crossing the ocean, but one that actually could significantly change and influence the process of colonization here in the lower Hudson. I'm mostly going to talk about one particular moment, a pretty infamous moment of violence known as Keith's War. But I want to step back for a second and let you know a little bit about what my book is saying. One of the main ideas is that I'm taking some key insights and approaches from people who study Native Americans and borderlands, the spaces in between empires, and applying them to a corner of the ocean. And when I call it the saltwater frontier, I'm actually referring to a larger coast than just the coast that we typically think of as being New Netherland. I'm referring to the coast from the Hudson River to around Cape Cod. In Native terms, we might say that's from Manhattan to Patuxet, which was the hometown of Squanto or Tisquantum. Now, one of the big ideas of my book is that when we foreground Native people and Native culture, we can see that this region really shouldn't be seen as just New England or New Netherland, or as two separate colonial stories, but rather as a complex single maritime zone with a shared history. And you can see in this map, I thought I had this going. As you can see here in this map, the 1635 map by Willem Janssen Blau, since you're all interested in New Netherland, New Amsterdam, this certainly is a familiar image to you, I'm sure. And as you can see in this map, New Netherland is stretching about all the way to the site of Providence, Rhode Island today. And of course, similar English maps from the period promote much of the same fiction. Both the Dutch and English empires claimed most of this shore as their own. And it was during the period of colonization that the region's connecting routes, its webs of commerce, and its theaters of war were primarily composed of bays, beaches, and watercraft. And the region's economic transformations centered not just on furs and beads and metal goods that you might know about, but also on shell beads made locally, on fish and on whale oil. And not just captives, but captive native pilots who were valued for their navigational skills. Now, the salt water in my title is not strictly literal. I'm not saying that land wasn't important to the colony, to colonization, or to native peoples. Of course it was. Instead, it's a way of referring to the many kinds of maritime and Atlantic connections, cultural, political, martial, and material, that formed a kind of borderland that wasn't entirely based on land. Now, to get the general idea here, I think it's important to say a few things about the native cultures that I'm talking about throughout this shore. And I've shown you here the major linguistic groups. We'll mainly be looking at people to the left, the people referred to as Munsee Lenape. Lenape is a larger group than just the Munsees. The Munsees are the northern speakers of the Lenape languages. Now, there's many things to be said about their culture, but in focusing on the maritime culture, it's worth noting that the craft used for offshore waters was typically not the small birch bark canoes we usually associate with native peoples, but in fact large dugouts that were capable of holding 20, 30, and in some cases up to 40 people. These are not small vessels. This is a replica from the lobby of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, which is run by the same tribal nation that runs Foxwoods Casino. This is one replica. They've actually since been working on a real in the water actual replica with Wampanoag boat builders that had its maiden voyage the summer before last. And there's several more traditionally made dugout boats being hosted both at Plymouth Plantation and now increasingly at the Pequot Museum. And what you can see if you remember the dialect map and then looking closer at the native groups as we understand them at this region at the point of contact, was that water was a key connector in this region, that people, both in terms of feeding themselves and connecting themselves with other villages, got around on water. And I had a little moment, I mentioned this in the book when I was writing it. I was here during Hurricane Sandy and was trapped for a week on Brooklyn, and it occurred to me that suddenly, without the bridges and without the subway, it becomes pretty obvious that water is the easiest way to get around this city, and it was for many years. As we sort of think about this region and how native people dealt with colonists, doubtless you've heard of wampum, which is the sacred shell beads among native people that also served as a kind of cross-cultural currency, and of course was crucial for many native nations in this region to engage with Dutch traders. They rather quickly ran out of fur to trade. Having a good that then could be traded among other native villages, in this case wampum or the shell beads that you can see in this man's portrait, were useful. And I like this portrait because it shows you the ubiquity of wampum. This is probably a Narragansett sachem from around the turn of the 18th century. It's one of the earliest, in some ways, attempting to be accurate or lifelike images of native peoples from the shore that we have. And you can see that his headband, his necklace, and his earrings are all made out of these it's deep purple and ivory white beads, pointing out, of course, that once brought into native communities, wampum was both a sacred gift and a decorative object. It wasn't just, as some people might say, Indian money. It had a larger value. And the more that we can see the connection of native villages in the shore to their Dutch trading partners, the more connections, there was also more conflict. And what I'd like to talk about today is my interpretation of a period of pretty intense violence between colonists and native people. There were two major events in the shore and in my region in the 1630s and the 1640s. The first, a war between the English and the Pequot Nation, known as the Pequot War. This is an illustration from an account of that war written by John Underhill. I have to ask here, any descendants of John Underhill here tonight? Good. I can tell you what I really think. Underhill led a raid on a Pequot village near the site of Mystic, Connecticut in May of 1637, in which approximately 400 men, women, and children were incinerated within about an hour's time. And this war, this rather quick and cunning English conquest of a powerful Indian nation, really helped them build a kind of coerced network of partners throughout the eastern side of the shore, and one that rather quickly posed a threat to the colony of New Netherland. Shortly after the war, a new untested governor named Willem Kieft came in command of the colony. And I detail the ways in which Kieft, who began with what was an attempted kind of good fences policy with native neighbors, managed to misread, misunderstand, and provoke his native neighbors into war, and that the process of simply dealing with native people in these tense standoffs where native people and Dutch people did not always get along or understand each other could be rather deadly. And one key point I make is that both the Pequot War and some of the initial hostilities that led to Kieft's War began on the water. So in the beginning of the Pequot War, an Englishman was killed in the Connecticut River in 1634, another off Block Island in 1636, and later in 1641, an attack of Raritan Indians upon a Dutch trading yacht off Staten Island also raised tensions. This is my visualization of some of the events of first the Pequot War, then leading to Kieft's War. Now, granted, these happened within the authority and control of two different colonial realms, but it's really inaccurate to say in any way that one of these wars happened in New England and one of these wars happened in New Netherland, because both wars would have an effect on both colonies. They allowed New England and New Netherland to end their initial tentative maritime-based stage of colonization and begin a more invasive territorial-based stage, where foreigners openly tried to subjugate their native neighbors. After the initial attack on Staten Island and the murder of a Dutch trader, in the summer of 1643, it was uneasy for all the people crossing the contested waters between Dutch and Munsee villages. Several elder sachems of Munsee peoples reported to the colonists that many of our youths were constantly wishing for a war. Kieft, the then director, upon hearing this, tried to use bounties to buy allies, offering handsome wampum payments to any sachems who, quote, would kill these young madcaps. Upon hearing this offer, David de Vries, who was a critic of the governor, said he laughed within himself, scoffing at the notion that an Indian should kill his friends for 200 fathoms of Zewan, that is 800 guilders, just to gratify us. After initial attacks in February of 1643, which included attacks that killed probably about 180 Munsee people, one attack happening on what they then called Curler's Hook, or the Lower East Side, the other one near the present site of Jersey City, there was attempts by both Munsee and Dutch leaders to form peace. But that fell apart, and soon the Munsee Alliance began to attack with vigor. And soon outlying Dutch farmers on Newark Bay and the Harlem River reported an alarming sight of fire-tipped arrows, glowing blue, whistling out of the darkness towards their homes. Frightened colonists began abandoning their many far-flung settlements, piling their possessions into canoe and seeking refuge within Fort Amsterdam. Eventually, the Dutch leadership decided they needed the help of someone who had experience with this kind of war, and they turned to John Underhill, who sometimes appears in their records as Jan Onderhill, and asked him to lead a joint force of English and Dutch colonists against Munsee villages. Using some of the same tactics he used in the Pequot War, he surprised settlements at night and waged destructive raids, much like the previous ones seen before. The most infamous was attack on a group of Wappinger and Tankete families near what's now Pound Ridge, New York, who had gathered to celebrate a winter festival and were surprised at night under a bright full moon in a deadly attack that killed possibly as many as 700 people, again in an hour's time. It was the deadliest day in a whole decade of fighting between colonists and Indians on this shore. And the massacre didn't immediately end the war, but it certainly demoralized the opposition and brought them to the negotiating table. Suing for peace, the native people of the region promised they would not come near the island of Manhattans as long as we Netherlanders are at war with other heathen, except in a canoe before Fort Amsterdam. In the last months of the war, a Long Island sachem allied with Governor Keefe, and with 47 of his own men, embarked in one of the sloops of the company, where he put ashore his spies to discover the enemy. Finally, a peace was signed in 1645. One English observer wrote, "After vast expenses and mutual slaughters of Dutch, English, and Indians, the Dutch were forced to save their plantation from ruin to make a most unworthy and dishonorable peace with the Indians." Most dishonored of all was Director Keefe. The war had been an utter disaster. All told, over 1,000 Munsees perished, scores of colonists died, and hundreds more fled back to Europe. Wartime horrors lingered in native communities across the shore. And this is a hard thing to get at, but we can see hints in colonial sources of the widespread trauma that surely followed both of these wars of invasion. There was the party of Pequots, who came upon the smoking remains of the Mystic Massacre, and, quote, beholding what was done, stamped and tore the hair from their heads, and soon began firing arrows wildly at English soldiers in a blind rage. A more resigned group later told Underhill, "We are a people bereaved of courage. Our hearts are saddened with the death of so many of our dear friends." And perhaps De Vries was referring to the widows of Keefe's War when he spoke of frequently seeing the wives of dead native men come daily to the grave, weeping and crying, pacing mournfully around the small hills that marked the burial plots of their husbands. There also wasn't much to celebrate in New Amsterdam either. The attempt at conquest had largely backfired when compared to what New England had accomplished years earlier. The English had decisively vanquished the Pequots and took thousands of acres of land as their spoils, while the Dutch had accomplished only a drawn-out and unambiguous victory against their Munsee opponents. In the Pequot War, English colonists had carefully inserted themselves in one side of an ongoing conflict between native peoples and escalated it, while in Keefe's War, colonists' sudden unprovoked attacks only inspired unity among the native people living near their village. Now, Keefe in particular faced an unhappy ending, though in his case, mere chance was to blame. He remained an unpopular director for 2 years after the peace was signed, and he remained deeply disliked by the people of New Netherland. Holding up in his house for many days on end, he made no secret of his dislike for the colony and all the people around it, native or Christian alike. When the Dutch West India Company relieved him of his command in 1643, he set off for home, but the vessel carrying him wrecked off the coast of Wales. He drowned along with the other 85 people aboard. Had he lived, the disgraced director likely would have faced a reckoning. A later series of inquests in New Amsterdam condemned him and his lieutenants for their conduct during the war. Certainly in the case of the Dutch, the war itself was a real turning point. And we know that in the following decades, as the sort of once semi-friendly relationship in between the English Crown, the English Commonwealth then, and the Dutch Republic turned violent, that New Amsterdam would become a fortified town with, of course, the wall that stood on Wall Street, there to protect mostly against an English but also a potential native attack. What we've also seen in the archaeological record is that native people were fortifying at the same time and increasingly borrowing features from European-style forts, the bastions you can see here at the corners, to defend against a new kind of war fought with firearms and fire. The landscape had been forever changed, and once open commerce had turned to a kind of paranoid landscape of fortification and suspicion in between neighbors. Later, when the English finally came to take over the Dutch colony, Peter Stuyvesant would reflect upon the decades of war that followed and the legacy he was left by Kieft, and basically conclude that wars with Indians had been a crucial disinhibitor of the colony's growth, and that it had distracted him, had taken away too many resources, and had left him in a state of vulnerability for the later conquest in 1664. The Dutch had the worst case scenario of what they feared, of being undermined, and quote, on one side by war with the savages and on the other side by the approach of the English, had indeed come true. Although, one thing I want to just pause here before we turn to these other speakers who might tell you very different things. Dutch relationships with Native people were not the same everywhere. The story that I've told was particularly about how the command of the colony, of mostly foreign governors, directors, dealt with Native people, which was usually with a fair amount of suspicion and an inability to understand Native ways of peacemaking, Native ways of diplomacy. But the Dutch colony was far-flung and different, and the story upriver is different, the story on the Delaware River is different, and there is no one single Dutch relationship with Native people, but indeed many. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next speaker is Cynthia Van Zandt, who's Associate Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire. She has an undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia and graduate degrees from the University of Connecticut. Her fabulous first book that was published in 2008 is called Brothers Among Nations, The Pursuit of Intercultural Alliances in Early America, 1580 to 1660, for sale in the lobby, to be signed by Cynthia after the event tonight. This is a wonderful view of not just New Netherland, but the way it's embedded in all kinds of networks and connections. I think following up on some of the things that we just heard about the smaller case of Kieft's War and the Pequot War, Cynthia has traced these networks throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. She's currently working on a book on the regicides, Whaley and Goff, and I think we're going to hear part of that tonight. So, Cynthia.
So here, to get the next. Perfect. Yeah, and that's what I want. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out. As Dan just told you, my book, Brothers Among Nations, was very interested in thinking about intercultural alliances and connections between people of different ethnicities and different nations in the early modern sense. And unlike Drew's talk before me tonight, I want to talk to you about a project that is still very much in process. And so to some extent, I think I have more questions than answers, but I hope you're going to find them very interesting questions. Writing in the 1650s and describing New Netherland, Adrian van der Donck had a section in which he described Native Americans, and one of the things that he had to say about them was this. He said, public policy in the proper sense, they have none. But there is a glimmer of government and something that in broader terms suggests policy. I think this short quotation captures something important, and although it sounds dismissive, I think, at first glance, I think we can see something else in it, which is that Europeans in North America recognized that Indian peoples had well-planned strategies for dealing with other nations, but they couldn't quite figure out what they were. They didn't understand them entirely, and they had a great deal of difficulty in trying to describe them for exactly that reason. But they knew they were there, and indeed they knew always that Native peoples were there. Indeed, in the map that I have up here, you can see this all across the landscape if you look carefully. And tonight I want to suggest that one important way to think about the Dutch and Native Americans in New Netherland is to consider the degree to which their lives and decisions intersected with the lives and decisions of their neighbors in North America, and in some ways even with people living across the Atlantic. My focus is really just a moment in the early 1660s, which at first seems to be entirely an English political matter and really have nothing to do with the Dutch or New Netherland or native peoples, but which upon closer examination I think turns out to have quite a number of connections to New Netherland. And as we take a closer look, we'll see that try as it might, New Netherland could not stay out of events affecting New England, and also we're going to see that Native Americans were very keen observers of European affairs, not just of colonial affairs, but of European affairs more broadly. And then the last point I really want to make today is that both Native American and European communications networks included the others to some extent. They certainly intersected, which was my title for this evening's talk, but I also think that they overlap and include each other. Well, before we talk about those connections, I want to tell you a story, and to do that, I'd like to remind you briefly of some events that in English history in the middle of the 17th century. Tensions between King Charles I and Parliament escalated throughout the 1630s, and civil war consumed the British Isles for most of the 1640s. Despite the battlefield successes of Parliament's new model army, Charles I just would not capitulate. And so a movement took hold in the new model army, which grew and spread, and which held that the king must be held accountable for the destruction and the tremendous number of lives lost in the civil wars. And so under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell and others, he didn't spearhead this single-handedly, but they convened a special court to try the King Charles I for the crime of treason against his own people. The court convened, and though the king never recognized its authority, it nonetheless proceeded and sentenced the king to death. Most of the men who sat in judgment on the king signed the king's death warrant, and that's what you're looking at right now. This is the death warrant for Charles I of England. And in January of 1649, King Charles I was beheaded, and England became a commonwealth. The men who served on the court and who signed this death warrant became known as regicides, although it's kind of an expansive term. And tonight I want to focus on two of them. Two men who are the subjects of the book I'm currently writing. Their names were Edward Whaley and William Gough. Edward Whaley, you should know, was Oliver Cromwell's cousin, and William Gough was married to Edward Whaley's daughter. And I think that's relevant because both of them were I'm sorry, I keep moving and I jump onto the microphone. Both of them were very closely associated with Cromwell throughout all of the civil wars, and then both of them were active in helping Cromwell and the new model army rule England for the decade of the 1650s. Indeed, when Cromwell divided the country into military districts, which were called associations, they were two of the army officers who were named as major generals to rule in the localities. And in fact, this map shows you what those military districts were during the period of military rule. And it shows you Whaley's association was Lincolnshire, and Gough's, you see to the south there, was Berkshire, Hampshire, and Sussex. They remained close to Cromwell until his death in 1658, and they stood by his decision to name his son Richard his heir, and so they supported Richard Cromwell as Lord Protector. But they were in a distinct minority at that point. Things soon fell apart after Oliver Cromwell's death, and a coalition of people who were by now quite disenchanted with Puritan and military rule successfully pushed for the restoration of the monarchy now, with Cromwell no longer at the helm. Charles II returned triumphantly to reclaim his crown, and Edward Whaley and William Gough got on a boat and sailed to New England. They sailed to Puritan, Massachusetts, and when they arrived, they were treated like heroes of the Revolution, which in a sense they were from the Puritan perspective. They were absolutely treated like conquering heroes, and they seem to have believed for several weeks that if they just stayed in Boston and Cambridge, that things would be okay. Charles II had returned to England saying that he wanted to heal a nation that had been torn apart by decades of strife and civil war, and he said he would pardon people. They didn't entirely believe him, clearly, because they hopped on a boat and sailed across the Atlantic. But they clearly had some hope that, you know, time heals all wounds, just give it some time, they'd be okay. But things were not going to be okay for regicides. Charles II indeed pardoned almost everyone, but he did not pardon the men who had tried and his father and signed the warrant and seen to his execution. And so this was a little awkward, you can imagine, for Massachusetts Bay. In November of 1660, they got a copy of the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, which informed them that the regicides would not be pardoned by the king. And of course, they had two very celebrated regicides right there in their midst. Once the news hit Massachusetts, Whaley and Gough ran. In the meantime, the authorities in Massachusetts Bay spent a couple of months trying to figure out what to do, actually. But Whaley and Gough headed west, in fact, and you can see actually at your upper left, you see New Haven. This is where they're going to end up in 1661 and spend the next 3 years. So Massachusetts hears that the king wants them. They don't stick around to find out what authorities in Massachusetts are going to do. They head west. And a few people know where they're going, but they are now officially fugitives. They're in hiding. This is a secret, and it's a pretty closely held secret exactly where they're going, but everybody's pretty sure they're going west. So when Massachusetts finally decides what to do, they appoint a couple of people to go hunt them down. And they empower them with a commission to hunt the regicides, and they give them letters to give to the governors of the colony of Connecticut and New Haven, and because they know they've gone west and they think maybe they've kept going west, they also give them a letter to give to Director General Stuyvesant. And for the English governors, they explain the situation and they tell them that they need to surrender the regicides Whaley and Gough, and they need to bring them to Boston so they can be sent back to England. To Stuyvesant, they explain the situation and they ask him if Whaley and Gough are in New Netherland, and they tell him if they are, they ask him if he would please apprehend them and return them to English jurisdiction. So they think they've covered their bases. And they do this partly because Charles II is worried about the Dutch. He's worried about the Dutch Republic, and he's worried about New Netherland. Now, the regicides we're interested in, Whaley and Gough, aren't in either place, but other regicides are in hiding in the Dutch Republic, and he's pretty sure he knows that. And here, since we know that the regicides started in Boston and headed west, New Netherland is a distinct possibility. And when I say that Charles II is worried about the Dutch, he's worried about them at this moment when Whaley and Gough go into hiding at first, but the Dutch example comes up again. In 1662, so our guys are now hiding in New Haven. Back in England in 1662, agents of Charles II have uncovered a plot, a grand conspiracy. It's known as the Tong plot, or Tong conspiracy, which people they interview, probably under torture, tell them was intended to kill the king and his ministers. Some of the men they question claim that an extensive network of religious radicals are poised to retake power in England. And as they continue to question them to try to find out exactly the extent of this conspiracy, one of the conspirators has news that they think is earth-shattering. So earth-shattering that they bring the king himself to question this guy. This guy tells Charles II that Whaley and Gough have sailed to Scotland from New England, and they've done it aboard a Dutch ship. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it automatically advancing? So I'm going to keep talking while he helps me. I want to go back, actually. Okay.
This one?
Okay, yes, we're good. No, okay. No, we can go forward again. Okay. That's it. I was looking at that. Perfect. Perfect. So Charles II, I told you, is afraid that the Dutch Republic is no friend of his, and they're not really. He's certainly no friend of theirs. They're harboring regicides. He also he's afraid that he doesn't have the power to keep radical Puritans from retaking the country if they can find a strong leader with military experience. And that's what he thinks Whaley is. So is it a relief that Whaley's in New England? Well, a little bit, but not so much, because New England is next to New Netherland. So, they're hiding out in New England, but if they're going to get back to lead this great rebellion, if not this time, then next time, because these guys say they're still planning, how are they going to get there? Charles II thinks the odds are pretty good that they're going to get there on a Dutch ship. And where are they going to get on a Dutch ship? Well, they're going to get on a Dutch ship at Manhattan. So I want to conclude by having us think about who else would have known about Whaley and Gough. And there I want us to think for a second about the fact that they've gone from Boston to Hartford to New Haven, which is where they end up for a few years. And they've done it, by all accounts, over land. And I want to suggest that it's impossible that Native Americans didn't see them go and didn't know where they were going. And also that Native peoples had to know that these men were fugitives. And I want to give you two examples that, although we often think Native Americans didn't know very much about European political affairs, show that, in fact, when it impinged on their interests, they absolutely did. In 1652, or possibly even earlier, New England Algonquians had heard rumors that the English and Dutch were likely to go to war, which of course they did in the First Anglo-Dutch War. It's one of the reasons that the Narragansett sachem Nenegrit spent a lot of time in and around Manhattan in the winter of 1652-53, because he knew what was happening in Europe. Narragansetts and probably other Native Americans heard rumors of the English Restoration as soon as colonists did, in fact, because Native peoples were all over this land just as European colonists were, and they were constantly passing information both for their own purposes, but they often served the role of carrying messages for Europeans. So we'd be mistaken, I think, to think that Native Americans didn't know that Whaley and Gough were in hiding, or possibly where they were. And I think given how close New Haven was to New Netherland, which you can see again in the map on your right, I think it's hard to imagine Native peoples in New Netherland not hearing about it either. The map on the left gives you a sense, unfortunately it's confined to New England, but it gives you a sense of many of the overland roads, trails and communication networks that we know were in frequent use by New England Native peoples, but of course they don't stop actually at that border. They continue on into the territory you can see on the map on your right. And in the story of the regicides Whaley and Gough, and I think in the Anglo-Dutch tensions of the 1650s and 60s, I think we can see some very important things. We can see that even when divided, people paid close attention to news and events and the affairs of others that might affect them too. We tend to think that people were divided by boundaries of language and territorial claims, and those things were true. They were at times, and at times it led them to conflict. But they also paid very careful attention to the times when the affairs of other people could be used to their own advantage or likely impinged on them. They understood in ways that I don't think we yet fully have come to, that their fates intersected. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thanks for sticking with us, everybody. Apologize for the slightly apocalyptic sound of the title of my talk, The Last Days of New Netherland. But we just heard a little bit about the last days of New Netherland, and I want to kind of look at this a little bit from the perspective of the native people up the Hudson River and in points adjacent, the folks known as the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee means the lodge extended, or the long house, or the people of the long house. They also refer to themselves in their own language as the Great League of Peace. Lived in what became much later the upstate New York, from just west of Albany to the Great Lakes. And famously, their great trading partner, of course, was New Netherland through its post at Fort Orange and the surrounding area of Beaverwick. Now, this is a complicated, long story about their relationship, and I want to mostly focus on its last, not very peaceful days. But it may be a good introduction to this is to look a little farther north to what people in New France thought about the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And this, I think, is in keeping with this theme of the cross connections of the different empires and the different places in this region. I think it is important to remember that, again, just as New Netherland blends into New England to the east, it blends into New France by way of a lot of Indian country in between to the north. So, in 1660, a priest named Jerome Lalemant, who was the principal figure in the Jesuit order in New France, had this to say. He said, "The warfare of the Iroquois thwarts all of our pleasures and is the sole affliction of New France, which is in danger of becoming utterly devastated unless prompt and powerful relief is rendered from France." And we'll see that in a few minutes that actually that relief was sent out in a few years, that the French Empire was really seeing the Iroquois as a major threat to the existence of its colony in North America, New France. Lalemant went on to say, "The Dutch took possession of these regions and conceived a fondness for the beavers of the natives some 30 years ago. This would be about 1630. It was actually late 20s. And in order to ensure them in greater number, they furnished these people with firearms, and that is what has rendered them formidable, that is the Haudenosaunee everywhere, and victorious over all the nations with whom they have been at war." So from the perspective of the French, the Iroquois are the big problem, the Haudenosaunee are the big problem, but behind the Iroquois is this colossus of the Dutch and their horrendous habit of selling firearms and other things to native people. Now, the wars he's talking about are these incredibly widespread campaigns of Native Americans in the 1640s, 50s, and into the early 1660s, in which the Haudenosaunee are certainly not a great league of peace. They're a great league for war, and they are making war on extraordinarily large areas of eastern North America. This map here, which I'm sure you can easily figure out everything that's going on here, tries to show some of those major arenas of conflict. Now, this is an actual Seneca pictograph from the period. Well, it's a French copy of a pictograph that would have been drawn on the side of a tree. And it shows a victorious Iroquois war party. And you'll note the prominent role the musket plays in this. That's one of those Dutch firearms. The Haudenosaunee got access to firearms considerably earlier than any of their neighbors, and it was because of their trading connections with the Dutch. A brand new book by David Silverman lays out a lot of this in much more detail than I was ever able to do. The book is called Fire Sticks. It's not for sale out there, but can be purchased on Amazon. You see the musket, and this guy is leading a very unfortunate captive who has what's known as a captive strap around his neck and is being made to sing his song and use a rattle to accompany himself. and then two even more unfortunate folks represented here by the fellow in the front. Okay. So this is a victorious war party. They're bringing back live captives and dead captives, okay, which is a central element of much of native warfare in the Northeast, but certainly the kind of warfare that the Iroquois were waging in the middle of the 17th century. This is what we've come to know as the Morning War. It's a hesitate to get into this complicated story, but I think probably most of you know that there were devastating epidemics throughout the Northeast, particularly starting in the 1630s. Smallpox in the 1630s and 40s. This is a part of those wars that Andrew was talking about. One of the major stressors is the fact that the Pequots are being hit very heavily by smallpox at that very moment, okay? These diseases are wiping out half or more of the populations throughout the Northeast. The Iroquois and many of their neighbors had a long-standing tradition that when someone died, one of the ways in which you responded to that death, part of the mourning rituals, was to find a person to literally replace that person in the family that has lost a loved one. There are many ways to do this, but one way was to wage war against one of your neighbors, take a captive, and incorporate that person into the community, either literally as a person who was adopted, maybe even made a slave, or symbolically through killing them and incorporating their scalps. The idea here is that the kin group has lost spiritual power through the death of someone. The way to reinvigorate that power is to literally and metaphorically replace those people in their families. So what the Iroquois are doing in these wars is they're raging far and wide among other communities that are also being hit terribly by diseases in an incredibly violent outburst of warfare designed primarily to capture people and bring them back to restock the population of Iroquois villages. Now, what makes this possible in the 1640s and 50s, again, is their strong trading relationship with the Dutch and their ability particularly to gain access to firearms, and for which they are trading beaver skins. As Lalemant said, the Dutch had this fondness for beaver, which of course is going to Europe to make hats, among other things. Okay, what I think Lalemant didn't appreciate, and what I think some other folks haven't appreciated enough, is that nobody on either side had any great illusions about the nature of the relationship between the Iroquois and the Dutch traders. An Iroquois spokesman said this in about 1660 at one point: "If the enemy should come, you will not care to help us. You people are too much afraid." A little blunt speaking to the Dutch. This is also the Dutch who've learned some lessons from their earlier violent encounters with native people. And then another favorite quote from this period: "The Dutch say we are brothers and that we are joined together with chains," that is, chains that are not chains like slavery, but chains that bind us together in a permanent way, right? But that lasts only as long as we have beavers. After that, we're no longer thought of, okay? So this is particularly important that we stress that, again, this relationship was always rather fragile, and it's probably worth thinking about that what the Dutch are doing is really being gun runners. No European is actually supposed to be selling firearms to native people, right? But it's at least a briefly very profitable trade. And one that is not only focused on beavers, but also on wampum, which we've heard about before. This sacred beads that come from around the Long Island Sound primarily, made of two kinds of shells, whelk and quahogs. So-called black wampum is actually purple. The white comes from the whelk shells. Now, this is something that the Dutch basically figure out the value of shell beads to native peoples very early on in their experience in New Netherland. They actually get the people of New England involved in the wampum trade. And there's this massive trade in wampum that goes on that Cynthia and others have talked about in her book. That is briefly very profitable to everybody, particularly to the Europeans, but that by about 1660 or so had become more of a burden on the Dutch economy than a benefit. And a number of complicated things happened. Wampum was ceasing to circulate as money in European communities at this point. The Dutch conquered the Swedish colony of New Sweden, and probably as a result cut their nose off to spite their face, because a big part of their wampum exports was going in that direction, and that trade is disrupted. What several historians have described as the great wampum inflation is going on in the late 50s and early 60s. The price of wampum is inflating by about 200%, okay, leading to catastrophic collapsing noises everywhere, and leading the people back home in Amsterdam to talk about, conjure up a wonderful image like this. It's a colony full of traders that had no furs, no trade goods, but was sitting meanwhile on their boxes full of wampum. And we see two big boxes of wampum here, and just kind of picture folks sitting around. Well, they're not sitting around, they're really quite desperate. And particularly in the area around Fort Orange, things are really turning nasty. People are just, the folks from Albany are trying to extract every last beaver skin they can from the Haudenosaunee. They are actually kidnapping people in the woods, stealing their furs, and it gets really quite brutal in this period, at a point where, for a whole variety of other complicated reasons, many of the Iroquois enemies have also begun to have substantial caches of firearms, which they're getting from New England, which they're getting from Maryland and Virginia. And the wars that had been so successful for the Iroquois up to that point are turning quite sour at the very moment where their main economic connection is being severely stressed. That's the last days of New Netherland. And I want you to note something from this map, which I'm sure you've memorized already. There is a gap in the years here of the wars of the Haudenosaunee. And you see the ones in circles, these are all in the 1650s, early 1660s. They don't pick up again really until the 1670s. And that precisely is because, I would argue, of the fall of New Netherland and the disruption of the trading connections that had made that success earlier possible. And this brings us to the English conquest, which you heard briefly about. It is important to remember that both the French and the English at this point are seeing the Dutch as their main threat in the Atlantic world as a whole. Both the English and the Dutch are trying to get into the African slave trade that the Dutch had dominated up to that point. The Second Anglo-Dutch War begins with two sneak attacks, one on New Netherland, the other on Dutch slaving posts in Africa. The French at the same time are getting involved in all those things. They revoke the charter of New France and put in a royal governor at about the same time. Okay? So the English conquest severely disrupts. Now, it's certainly there are Dutch traders there. There's complicated deals where the Dutch get to send a ship or two every year back and forth to Amsterdam. But the firearms trade is really disrupted at this very crucial moment for the Iroquois, at just the moment when the French also reformed their government of New France, sent out a new governor and a new viceroy, and 1,000 French soldiers whose orders are, not to put too fine a point on it, totally to extirpate the Iroquois. That never worked out. They did invade the Haudenosaunee country a couple of times. They did force the Haudenosaunee to make peace, primarily because the Iroquois had no choice with this big military threat to their north, and their economic ties to New Netherland disrupted so dramatically. So I could have gone on, but we're under strict time limits. I was trying to enforce time limits for the other two, and we'll leave it at that. But I think it is an important moment. The fall of New Netherland is something that resonates throughout Eastern North America. And it also reveals how central Native Americans and Native American affairs were not just to New Netherland, but to the imperial competition in general. And I think it's not too much to say that in the events that combine in 1664-65 with the conquest of New Netherland, the transformation of the government of New France, we get, because of the Iroquois being at the center of this, we get the origins of the long-standing conflict between the French and the English in North America that would not be resolved for the better part of a century. So that in a nutshell is the last days of New Netherland. We have plenty of time for questions, and I think we're all going to sit up here and let you put them to both of us, to all of us.
Thank you. I can't quite see it.
We'll do the Q&A. We just really want to thank our wonderful speakers, Fran, Cynthia, Andrew, for enlightening us and actually wanting us to hear more, which we can get if we buy the book, right? So don't forget that. One other thing, Yasmin reminded me that the event on November 18th at the Botanical Garden is available to members only. That's no problem, because in the back of your program, you'll see how you can sign up. So please do. And now some questions.
Okay, questions for any of us? Yes, ma'am. The question is, how do we explain the no resistance, for the most part, on the part of the Dutch when the English showed up? New Netherland was an economic basket case. I think many of the people there had no particular faith in the future of this colony. There's I think, a couple of books that recently helped to explain this. One by Jaap Jacobs called just New Netherland, The Colony of New Netherland. The other very recent book by Willem Klooster called The Dutch Moment. The Dutch Moment. And he particularly makes the argument that the Dutch West India Company was an extremely bad employer and alienated its own employees and its own colonists. Stuyvesant was doing the best he could, but there was just no way he could rally these people around, particularly when a small fleet showed up with some guns to engage in any resistance. Cynthia, you probably know more about it than
I think that handles it pretty nicely in a nutshell. And I think, you know, in the context of the hard times that Dan was just telling us about, there's also the fear of, so if you resist and lose, which seemed quite likely in this moment, the consequences then are horrific, because then New Amsterdam is open for pillage completely by the invading troops. And this way, I mean, he saved the community.
No, it's not, but I think that recent historiography has really punched a hole in that idea that the great trading company was so great.
Well, I think the wampum inflation just destroyed the economy, and it hadn't rebounded. It wasn't rebounding.
Right, and you know that, and the wars with the native people in this in the area around Manhattan. The fact that the Haudenosaunee are being pressured on all sides militarily with the French as well, and their many native enemies. This is disrupting, you know, the disruption in the Fort Orange economy is on both sides, both, you know, and so that whatever profits were coming out of Fort Orange are drastically reduced in this period. The directors of the Dutch West India Company have been fighting for years over what's the purpose of New Netherland. We're supposed to be sending colonists out there to be farmers. Is it going to be a trading? Is it just going to be a place to base ships from? So there was kind of a lack of leadership at the top, a kind of general economic depression, and also I think, as Cynthia said, you know, if they hadn't surrendered, they certainly didn't have the military ability to really resist. And so I think they decided they'd try to live to fight another day, which they did, by the way, in that, of course, briefly in the next Anglo-Dutch War, New Netherland went back to the Dutch. And in that period as well, my sense is that the English government of New York is far more concerned about New England and controlling New Amsterdam, now New York, than what's going on up in Haudenosaunee country. And it's only after the second transfer in 1674 that the English really start paying much attention to what's going on up there.
Yeah, can I just add to that or expand? I think that it's a really important point to understand that in this period, colonial territories flipped pretty regularly. So we all know how things turned out. We know that the Dutch aren't going to get New Netherland back, or they don't keep it when they do. But for people living in the 1660s and 70s, there were plenty of other examples where they had seen territory flip to a rival power, but then return to the earlier possessor. And I think it wasn't unreasonable for them to think that might happen here too. It was a multi-ethnic place, Firth.
Yeah. Right.
Yes, yeah. Right. Right. Well, and one of the things that happens in the 1660s also, which none of us quite touched on, are the Esopus Wars. So just to add to the litany of problems besetting the colony.
Right. Yes, back here. Yeah.
In other words, English settlers and even English towns in New Netherlands.
Well, one of the remarkable things about New Netherland is that they welcome almost anybody, and there certainly was most of Long Island was English. So.
It's actually, before the Dutch ship arrives, there's actually a sort of brief eastern invasion of New Netherland, which many towns are now part of Kings and Queens County and Westchester County are briefly invaded, then sort of they beg off, but there's this moment in which basically you have sort of posses of Puritans coming and claiming these English majority towns as part of mainly the New Haven colony at that moment. And we also have, at that precise moment, Raritan Indians inviting English people to come and buy their land on the other side of New York Bay, just sort of as a provocation against the English, because the Raritans have this long-standing disagreement with the Dutch governors, and they're just looking to undermine the Dutch as best they can. So they're sort of done in on all sides, and it's leadership at the top. The individual colonists, are in many ways living these sort of weirdly intertwined lives with Native people. It's all about leadership in the political structure, really.
And remember that phrase, posses of Puritans. That's
a good one.
Yes, sir.
The relationship between the natives and the French, English, Dutch is comparable to the relationship between the natives and the Spanish in the South, or maybe the natives and the English in Virginia and the Carolinas. As the Northeast is a story by itself.
Right.
I think there's this whole field of historians sort of saying, okay, let's stop looking at the history through the one group of colonial sources and telling this as the New Netherland frontier or the New England frontier, and just saying, let's look at a region, and that's how you end up with these very complex stories of people from different empires. And the word that you see a lot when historians talk about this kind of work is kaleidoscopic. So every little region has its particular mix of different imperial powers acting in different ways, different native powers acting in different ways. So nothing's exactly alike, but the kind of churn and constant jousting is a constant throughout North America really from the Gulf of Mexico on up north of New England.
Lots of hands now. I didn't see who was first, but I'll go with you in the second round.
I want to ask you about something that's interested me for a while. The Indian Wars, Peace War. You look at the events and you seem like it's not battles, it's massive. At the beginning of the war, he manufactured kind of like machetes and arm the people he had available and sent them to Quits Bay, where they wiped out a village and brought the heads back. Around this time, too, the Dutch were
I'm hesitant now to say for sure that. So here's the question.
The question was whether.
Did the Dutch arm the slaves that were owned by the West India Company to fight Native Americans? The ones you know about, Palo, Angola, Group Manuel.
Yes.
Who have been there for a long time and whose part of their obligation is to help defend the colony.
I'm currently just I'm racking my brains to say if I remember seeing exactly in a document. I know it's discussed, and I also, one thing in my sort of reread of the sources leading up to Kief's War is this ongoing gulf in between the ordinary sailors and soldiers of the Dutch West India Company, who are often just passing through New Amsterdam, and Kieft, who's sort of an upright guy and doesn't want all the drinking and carousing that happens with sailors and soldiers. So when he tries to, and I argue in many ways is sort of, in some ways he's more afraid of his sailors and soldiers and the issues that they present to him than he is necessarily afraid of natives, and that's why he has this sort of overreaching and dominant policy. And then when he tries to raise an army to fight native people, there's sort of ongoing sort of jokes, so, well, why aren't you coming to lead us, sir? And there's a sort of general resentment clearly among both leading colonists and soldiers towards Kieft. So he does have this problem of trying to raise enough men. I think it's likely. I haven't gone back and checked and looked for that problem, so I can't answer for sure whether it happens or not. But I know the problem of staffing those armies is a big one, especially early on when it just seems like an unnecessary, it's a war of aggression. And it's against the interests of most of the colonists around around New Amsterdam. I mean, he's immediately vilified and unpopular the entire war. So it's not just historians coming and saying, "Look at this man, his aggressive colonial war." That's the way that most Dutch colonists felt about Kieft during the war.
Okay. Yes, back here with the yellow tie. Yeah. There were constant rumors and reports that the Dutch were selling muskets to the Spanish. The question is, was this an official project of the Dutch West India Company to sell firearms or a private business? Now, one of the things about an illegal trade is that not much is written down. So I think two things have to go into this mix. Where are they getting the firearms? And I need to go back to David Silverman's book and see what he says about that.
I haven't read David's book yet. I think Jaap Jacobs talks about this a little bit in his book. And he and many historians have grappled with the problem that the directors general grappled with, which is it's a slippery trade and nobody was ever able to control it entirely. So to some extent the answer is yes, by which I mean individual colonists do trade arms and ammunition to native peoples, but there is a point at which I believe the West India Company directs, sort of says we actually need to, there's a fine line we need to walk through. We need not to alienate the native people so much that they turn on us when we have another war, and they're demanding arms, and if they don't get them from us, they're going to get them from the English and the French. So you need to sell them some arms, but try to sell as few as possible. And they try to to restrict it to, eventually, I think, to a company monopoly, but I don't think they're successful.
No, not at all. Just in the question of Dutch firearms, one point I made is that when it comes to King Philip's War, it's almost certain that most of the arms and shot and powder that is being aimed at the English, a good amount of it, although some of it's come from English illegal traders as well, but a good amount has come from Dutch. And it's sort of a little bit of Dutch revenge for the conquest of New Netherlands. Is one way we can think of it.
I'm curious about the cultural differences between the native people and Europeans coming in involving private property. property specifically, and that idea of owning land individually. So could you speak a little bit to that and how that may have exacerbated or caused some of the conflicts between the two?
Question is about the cultural differences over property, private property, land ownership between Native peoples and Europeans. Who wants to take the first? What's that? Yeah, well, that's right. He's the water guy, not the land. It is true that in Eastern Native American societies, land was generally owned collectively by kin groups. And there's considerable differences from one, particularly between Algonquian speakers and Iroquois speakers, as to how those kinship groups are organized and who can speak for them. But it's not true that they don't have land ownership. It's very clear that certain kin groups have at least use rights to particular kinds of land. Right? And those use rights are not necessarily unitary. I mean, you can have an agreement with somebody that they can hunt on a piece of land, but that doesn't mean they can farm there. They can fish there, but that doesn't mean they can hunt there, right? And so it's not a gap that Native people don't grasp the concept that you can transfer the rights to use some land to somebody else. Right? The differences come in, again, in terms of individual property holding, and the European idea that once you buy land, you bought that land, and you bought all use rights to use that land. And that's the conflict. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that by the time that, at least Cynthia and I are talking about the 1660s or so, all these Native groups have a generation or two of experience with Europeans. They know exactly what Europeans are doing when they want to buy land at that point, right? And very much understand what's involved in that process. Yes?
Stuyvesant came to power was there an attempt by Stuyvesant to try to modify or lessen the conflict with the Indians? Because obviously it's very devastating to keep the rebels in the war when discussing more of the locale and the Westchester law. The Iroquois issue was certainly more than foreign territory. But my sense was from when I was reading the thesis that he was trying to quiet that down.
So the question is, was Stuyvesant trying to quiet down the previous conflicts with the Native people?
I think the short answer is yes. He's not necessarily, he's not the most adept cultural diplomat, but he does realize that you need to maintain a relationship, and the fact that there is not then, any time during Stuyvesant's rule, a particular conflict would be most proximate. He gets into wars and various conflicts with Susquehannocks and the Iroquois speaking group, with Munsees a little bit further up the river, and those conflicts begin for similar reasons of sort of trade's gone bad and overreacting. He's not in any way sort of a perfect diplomat, but it's this sort of exhaustion and both the combination of sort of fear, exhaustion, resignation, and a desire to simply try to survive that leads to both the Dutch and Native people closer to the Lower Hudson. I think getting on better during Keith's War, after Keith's War. And Stuyvesant will also particularly build a relationship with a Massapequa station named Takpasha, and he will again and again sort of turn to Takpasha to raise a number of fighting men from Long Island to fight the Esopus people in the Hudson Valley. So he certainly learns, is more cognizant of the value of the Native alliance in the most basic sense than Keith ever was, but Keith sets the bar so low, it's not easy, it's not that hard to walk over, basically.
So when the economy eventually collapsed, the tensions and problems with the natives was still a significant factor.
Yeah, still very much so with Native people in the Hudson Valley, with Native people further inland, Susquehannocks in particular. It's not an unblemished record by any stretch of the
Yeah, and certainly the English don't have a good reputation among Native people to be able to come in and be welcomed with open arms. We are a little bit over time. Maybe one more question?
We could take two more questions.
Two more questions. Yeah. On the first, Howard, yes.
I had heard that the British built the Bridewell and the almshouse along the southern edges of Flat spill over between French and English. Do you know if that's true? And if it was ever tested, because they took a riffraff up there as federal country law.
The question was the bridewell and the workhouse were they built specifically to be a kind of last line of defense against, or first line of defense against French invaders?
I can't say that I know.
Anyone want to ask anybody in the audience?
Does.
We've got some people who are more expert on the Netherlands here than us. Okay. Well, you stumped the panel for that one.
It'll be a problem.
Okay, one more question. Is there something we could guess?
Yes, in today's political debates, one hears the statement that people in this room are considered to be illegal immigrants from the perspective of Native Americans. How the selling of firearms to natives by the Dutch, did we consider the Native Americans as our equals and vice versa? Was their approach different? Was it a success?
The question is, in the context of what one frequently hears today, that all of us in this room are illegal immigrants from the perspective of Native Americans, and then moving into, I think, a question about attitudes on both sides that they see each other as equals, and particularly the Europeans see other people as equals. I haven't stumped the panel. I think we're just going to, we need a couple hours.
Maybe the cute and quick answer is I think both sides saw the other as lesser.
I think that's right. And in contra-denominations, for sale I also argue that both sides regarded the other side as inferior, but they were able to coexist at times in between conflicts through essentially the intersection of mutual self-interest. Where their self-interest intersected, then they could get along, but it wasn't because they regarded each other as equals.
Yeah, I'd probably go back to one of those quotes that I showed you. It doesn't mean we say we are brothers, but it only lasts as long as we have keepers. I think that epitomizes the self-interest.
It's the whole idea of illegal immigration, 19th and 20th century, or especially the 20th century idea. I know that some Dutch people in Iowa in the 1880s just came, and after 6 months went to City Hall and said, "Hi, I'm here," and they would say, "Here's where you pay your taxes, here's where you vote." The whole idea started in the 1920s when there were laws against certain immigration groups, the Chinese, and then there were others, so Asian in general. So the whole idea is a fairly modern idea. In Europe, I don't think there were passports until the 1900s. People just moved from Holland to Germany and beyond and just wandered around.
Yeah, answer or shall I one quick answer to that?
Yeah, well, I would agree that the term is anachronistic.
I'm sure you'll all want to join me in thanking our panel for a very